There is no secret fight between Princess Leonor and the Spanish Parliament. If you've seen that phrase attached to a video, treat it the same way you'd treat any headline promising a hidden feud where the public record shows none. But underneath that clickbait framing sits something real, something far more interesting than a manufactured personal conflict, and it deserves the full 30 minutes we're about to spend on it. This is the story of how Spain's parliament and its future queen are bound together by law in ways that are genuinely tense, genuinely unresolved in parts, and genuinely worth understanding if you want to know what kind of monarch Leonor will actually become. Let's start with the moment that made this tension visible to the entire world. On October 31, 2023, Leonor turned 18, and by Spanish law, that birthday triggered a specific constitutional event. She was required to appear before a special joint session of Parliament, the Cortes Generales, and swear an oath to uphold the Constitution and remain loyal to the king. This isn't a ceremonial nicety. It's written into Article 61 of the Spanish Constitution, and it's the legal mechanism by which an heir formally activates their capacity to serve as head of state, including as regent if the king is ever unable to fulfill his duties. Giant screens were set up in Madrid's Puerta del Sol so the public could watch. The streets were decorated. Leonor stood before Congress and the Senate, Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez beside her, and pledged her loyalty. And then something happened that told you everything about the real relationship between this princess and this parliament. A significant number of lawmakers didn't show up. Politicians from Catalan and Basque pro-independence parties boycotted the ceremony entirely. 3 cabinet ministers from Sumar, the left-wing coalition partner in Spain's government at the time, also stayed away. This wasn't a scheduling conflict. It was a deliberate, public act of political dissent, carried out on the exact day the country's institutions were asking everyone to affirm loyalty to the crown. Reporters covering the event described Leonor as swearing allegiance to a nation still visibly divided over whether the monarchy should exist at all. That's the real fight. Not Leonor against individual lawmakers, not some personal vendetta, but the structural reality that Spain's parliament contains within it members who fundamentally reject the institution she is constitutionally bound to inherit. And she cannot resolve that by being gracious, by performing well, by giving a good speech. It's baked into the math of Spanish politics. Catalan and Basque nationalist parties regularly hold enough seats to matter in coalition negotiations, and a portion of them are Republican by conviction, not just by tactical positioning. Every time Leonor appears before Parliament in any official capacity, that division is sitting in the room with her, whether or not it's visible on camera. To understand why this matters so much, you have to understand how thin the legal thread actually is that connects an heir to the throne to actual governing power in Spain. Under Article 56 of the Constitution, the king, and by extension the heir, is defined as the head of state, but with authority that is almost entirely symbolic and procedural. The monarch sanctions and promulgates laws passed by Parliament, but cannot originate legislation, veto it, or meaningfully block it. The monarch's signature is required, but the substance of governing power sits entirely with the elected Cortes Generales and the Prime Minister. This is what political scientists call a parliamentary monarchy, structurally similar to the UK or the Netherlands, where the crown reigns but does not rule. That distinction is exactly why Leonor's political science degree at Carlos III University, which she begins this September, is being read so closely by royal watchers and Spanish political commentators. The royal household confirmed she'll be studying a 4-year, multidisciplinary program covering political science, law, economics, sociology, history, and international relations at the university's Getafe campus. She was admitted through the standard process for students who completed secondary education abroad, following her time at UWC Atlantic College in Wales. On paper, this looks like an ordinary academic decision. In context, it's the clearest signal yet of how seriously the institution is preparing her to understand the machinery of the parliament she will spend her reign formally, procedurally, and almost powerlessly attached to. This is where the real tension lives, and it's worth sitting with because it's easy to miss if you're only looking for scandal. The tension isn't Leonor versus Parliament as adversaries. It's Leonor versus the structural loneliness of a role that requires total public loyalty to institutions she has almost no power over, in a country where a meaningful share of the elected parliament doesn't believe her role should exist. Imagine training your entire adolescence and young adulthood, 3 years of military service across the Army, Navy, and Air and Space Force, an 18th birthday spent swearing constitutional oaths instead of celebrating with friends, an entire university degree chosen specifically to prepare you to understand a legislature that includes members actively working toward your institution's abolition, all so that one day you can occupy a position with essentially zero independent political power. That's not a fight. That's something closer to institutional endurance, and it's baked into the design of the modern Spanish crown on purpose. Let's go back further, because the current tension between crown and parliament didn't start with Leonor. It was inherited, quite literally, from her grandfather. Juan Carlos I abdicated the throne in 2014 following a wave of corruption scandals, financial improprieties, and a widely mocked elephant hunting trip to Botswana that badly damaged the monarchy's standing during a period of national economic hardship. He later left Spain for Abu Dhabi in 2020, amid ongoing financial investigations, an exile that remains one of the most consequential events in the modern history of the Spanish crown. José Antonio Zarzalejos, a former editor of the royalist newspaper ABC, put it plainly when discussing the family's trajectory: Juan Carlos was a foundational king undone by money and personal conduct, and it fell to Felipe to rebuild the institution's credibility. Felipe's response was to distance himself sharply from his father's conduct. He renounced any personal inheritance from Juan Carlos and introduced a formal code of conduct governing the financial and personal behavior of working royals, an attempt to insulate the crown from the kind of scandal that nearly broke it. But you cannot legislate away Parliament's memory. Every boycott of a royal ceremony, every abstention, every public statement from a Basque or Catalan lawmaker questioning the monarchy's legitimacy carries an implicit reference back to Juan Carlos, even when the person being sworn in is a 20-year-old who had no part in any of it. Leonor inherited not just a title but a credibility deficit that Parliament has never fully closed, and that she is constitutionally required to keep showing up in front of, ceremony after ceremony, for the rest of her public life. This is also where the deeper structural fight sits, the one that rarely gets discussed because it's less visually dramatic than a boycotted ceremony: the ongoing, unresolved Republican current within Spanish parliamentary politics itself. Polling on Spanish attitudes toward the monarchy, including work from the University of Murcia's long-running research into public trust in the crown, has repeatedly shown a country that is not united behind the institution Leonor is set to inherit. Support skews by region, by age, and sharply by political affiliation, with Republican sentiment concentrated in exactly the regions, Catalonia and the Basque Country chief among them, where nationalist and independence parties hold seats in the very parliament Leonor swore her oath before. That means the tension isn't a fringe position. It's represented, seated, and voting inside the institution she constitutionally answers to. None of this means Leonor faces daily hostility from lawmakers, and it's important to be precise here, because inflating this into personal conflict is exactly the kind of distortion this channel exists to correct. There's no reporting of Leonor clashing with Parliament, no record of confrontations, no evidence of an active dispute between her and any government body. What exists is structural, not personal, a parliamentary system that includes vocal, organized opposition to the very existence of her future role, expressed through boycotts, absences, and public commentary rather than through any interaction with Leonor herself. She has, by every available account, handled her public appearances with composure. King Felipe himself, addressing her at her military graduation this past July, said he could see her years of training helping her understand and fully embrace the sense of duty at the core of that life, language that reads less like a father praising a daughter's hobby and more like a monarch preparing his successor for exactly this kind of structural weight. There's one more layer worth understanding, because it explains why this tension is likely to define Leonor's reign for decades rather than resolve itself. Spain's constitution makes changing or abolishing the monarchy an extraordinarily difficult process by design. Article 168 requires any change to the Crown's provisions in the Constitution, Title II specifically, to go through what's called the aggravated reform procedure, approval by a 2/3 majority in both chambers of Parliament, dissolution of the Cortes, elections, ratification by a 2/3 majority in the newly elected Parliament, and finally a binding national referendum. It is, functionally, one of the hardest things to do in Spanish politics. This means the Republican current inside Parliament, however sincerely held, has essentially no realistic legislative path to actually ending the monarchy under current political conditions. What that current can do, and has done, is register its objection symbolically, through boycotts and abstentions, forcing every constitutional ceremony involving Leonor to double as a visible referendum on legitimacy, even though no actual referendum is remotely close to happening. That's the real secret, if you want to call it that. It's not a hidden feud. It's a structural standoff built directly into the Spanish Constitution, an heir who cannot be legally removed without one of the most difficult constitutional processes in Europe, standing before a parliament that contains members who will never accept her role as legitimate but who also lack the numbers or the process to change that fact. Both sides are, in a sense, constitutionally trapped in relationship with each other. Leonor cannot make the opposition disappear by being well-liked. The opposition cannot remove her by being loud. And so the country proceeds, ceremony after ceremony, oath after oath, with that tension fully intact and fully unresolved. What makes Leonor's position particularly demanding, compared to her father's at the same age, is timing. Felipe came of age in a Spain still riding high on the credibility his own father had built in the transition to democracy, before the scandals that would later unravel it. Leonor is coming of age after that credibility was spent, in a political environment where regional nationalist parties hold real bargaining power in a fragmented parliament, and where her every formal appearance is read, fairly or not, against the backdrop of her grandfather's exile. Her political science education isn't just preparation for constitutional ceremony. It's preparation for governing, in the narrow, symbolic sense the Spanish crown allows, inside a parliament that will likely never be fully reconciled to her role, for as long as the current political coalition math in Spain holds. So if you came here expecting a scandal, a secret confrontation, some dramatic falling out between a princess and her country's legislature, that's not what the record supports, and I won't manufacture one to hold your attention. What the record supports is more durable and, frankly, more worth understanding. A young woman formally, legally, and repeatedly bound to swear loyalty to a parliament that includes members who will spend her entire reign publicly declining to reciprocate that loyalty, inside a constitutional system specifically engineered to make that standoff permanent rather than resolvable. That's not a secret fight. That's simply what it means to be the heir to a modern parliamentary monarchy in a country that has never fully agreed on whether it wants one. We'll be tracking how this plays out as Leonor begins her degree this September and takes on more independent public duties, including presiding solo over this October's Princess of Asturias Awards for the first time. If you want the accurate version of this story instead of the manufactured one, subscribe, and we'll keep bringing you the version that's actually true.